Welcome to Must Read Classics, a series of interviews that focus on books in homiletics that, by virtue of their enduring impact, have attained the level of classic. Today, our book of focus is As One Without Authority, which was written in the early 1970s by Fred Craddock of revered memory. And Fred wrote this book as I say, in the early 1970s, and I've invited his friend and colleague, Dr. Thomas Long, to be our guest today to talk about the book. Dr. Long is the Bandy Professor of Homiletics Emeritus at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. And he's a distinguished preacher and teacher of preaching and a prolific author himself. And on a personal note, he endured being my doctoral dissertation advisor many years ago. And in the time since, I've appreciated, Tom, your encouragement and your support in my own work.
So pleasure.
Thanks so much for taking time to talk about this book today.
Delighted to do so.
So our purpose in these interviews is to refresh the memories of those who've read the book, but maybe not lately, and then to introduce the book to a new generation of readers who might wonder, and here's a place we can start, what is up with this title, As One Without Authority?
Right. That title has been very controversial. In fact, a respondent book was created called As One with Authority, reasserting.
Right.
It may be that a more accurate title would have been A Shift of Authority, because what Fred was doing was challenging the reigning model of the preacher as the authority and the one who has all the knowledge and wisdom, and shifting the authority to the listener, so that the sermon becomes, instead of let me tell you what is true and wise, but an invitation for the listener to discover what is true and wise and to name it at the end of the sermon. Which is a much more powerful communication model, really, because then you own what you have named.
Right, and you experience it rather than just
be
able to cite the theme at lunch.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah. Fred had done some study of what was a new wrinkle in biblical interpretation called the new hermeneutic. And the new hermeneutic focused not on what texts mean, but on what they cause to happen, the event-making quality of biblical texts. And so suddenly the sermon under Fred's leadership became an event-producing instrument, rather than simply, it moved from the message to the event.
So more holistic, kind of experiential sort of.
Yeah, more experiential, exactly.
Right. And as I was rereading the book myself, I couldn't help but see that there is this seismic shift, really, in every component of the preaching act.
Fred actually, I think, built off some work by William Sangster, who had written a book a generation before called The Craft of the Sermon, in which Sangster just sort of noted in passing that there were two kinds of preaching, deductive and inductive. And Fred took those two categories, deductive and inductive, and figured out that most preaching in his time was deductive. You started with an idea, you subdivided it into points, and then when you had done your 3 points or whatever, you would state the idea and the conclusion again. And Fred moved it toward induction, which was, you don't state at the beginning of the sermon what it's about. You guide the listener toward a discovery of it at the end. It creates an aha at the end of the sermon. It was a paradigm shift in preaching, and very attractive. I think American preaching has a nervous breakdown about every 75 years when we figure out that what we've been doing is not effective anymore. And something has to shift because something has shifted in the culture. And Fred was right on top of that shift, I think, with that book.
Because a lot of what makes a book make a big splash is context, isn't it? And timing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that one of the values of that book was not simply the arguments that it made in the pages, but the fact that it was embodied in Fred Craddock's own preaching. Right. In some ways, the method in As One Without Authority is hard to do, but it's a heuristic approach. It's a suggestive idea that bears a lot of fruit. And if you wanted to see it in action, all you had to do is to listen to one of these remarkable Fred Craddock sermons, which were witty and conversational and structured in a way that was remarkable and different. And his own embodiment, he was a short man with a high voice, so he went against the grain of all the stereotypical virtues of preaching, and it was exactly what we needed.
Right. And then we found out that not everyone is Fred Craddock, right?
That's right. Yeah, there's some funny stories of 6'5" preachers with gravelly voices trying to become squeaky short. Preachers imitate.
Right.
Yeah.
And I noticed in the book too, he takes into account that this could degenerate into just casual conversation with your hands in your pockets, and tries to talk about ways that these stories that we use could have depth. Yeah,
the powerful moments that to most listeners about the kind of preaching that Fred did was in the storytelling. And it was often homespun kind of stories, autobiographical stories. What got masked a little bit was the generative power of the biblical text. Fred was a master interpreter of scripture.
Right.
And so the scripture was always there powering the sermon, but in very subtle ways that many listeners didn't notice. They experienced it, but they wouldn't have been able to name it.
Right.
And a lot of the imitators of Craddock were not nearly as good at the biblical stuff. And so it got to be talking about grandma's quilt making and things that are irrelevant.
Right. Yeah, because he really did want to connect with the context and the text.
Exactly.
And you think honoring human experience in general in the whole process.
Yeah. I think that one hidden piece of that book was the general boredom that people were experiencing about preaching. We've been through the 50s and the 60s revolution, and we're into the collapse of authority in the 70s. And people were tired of know-it-all preachers with know-it-all sermons. And Fred's approach addressed boredom. It re-enchanted the preaching moment. Mm-hmm. One could argue that while there's still plenty of boredom, boredom is not the main crisis today. A lack of formation is. Mm-hmm. And so some of the things that were washed out of the preaching process by Fred's approach now need to find their way back in without losing what we have gained from Fred's approach.
Right. So I know some of the critique of his approach and what followed was that it was biblical teaching light, L-I-T-E, and probably not quite fair. But today people are hungry for biblical learning.
Yeah, I often quote Augustine saying the purpose of a sermon is to teach, to delight, and to persuade, that is, to create ethical response. And Fred's emphasized the delight, and we needed it because we were no longer delighted.
Right.
But now we're no longer educated, and we also have ethical challenges that are striking before us. And so those two aspects, the teaching and the persuading, need to come back into preaching, I think. Mm-hmm.
But if you were to tell someone who was unfamiliar with the book a reason that it is still a classic and still that they still need to read it and ingest it, what would that be?
I think you could name a number of virtues, but the one I think that really makes it last is that it freed up most of us who were preachers to be more human and more humane in the pulpit. And we didn't have to pretend to have an authority or a wisdom that we didn't have. We were on a journey with our hearers, not instructing them as if we were an assistant principal at the high school.
Yes. And is that how you'd summarize maybe his impact on your own preaching and teaching?
Yeah, I went through, I've had several mentors in preaching who have changed my preaching, and Fred is one of them. And in each case, one goes through, or at least I go through, I want to be like that. And so I imitate it for a while. And then I realized that Saul's armor doesn't fit. And I then create my own version of what I have learned from my mentor. And I've done that with Fred's preaching.
Right. Well, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us about As One Without Authority.
My pleasure.
So those of you who have read the book, but maybe not recently, immediately go and get it off your shelf and reread it. And those of you unfamiliar with it, immediately go and order it online. As One Without Authority, Fred Craddock's wisdom lives on. Thanks, Tom. Appreciate your time.
Pleasure.